Adding textures to our images has always been a popular presentation technique, and as usual there's quite a few ways we can do this. Photoshop comes with textures like sandstone, canvas, burlap and brick, but it doesn't end there. A search online will identify others that you can download. I have a few textures that I've acquired over the years in folders with headings like cloth, leather, paint and paper. If you do locate textures from the internet, they usually need to be in Photoshop format so we can locate them through the filters and the texturizer menu, but they may look something like this if you view them in Bridge or in Photoshop itself. Here's a couple of textures that I downloaded from the internet earlier today. The reason there's 4 there is because it downloaded as a PNG file, so I got this one and this one, but I've opened them both up into Photoshop and saved them as a PSD file so that I can find them when I go into the filters and the texturizer. So let me show you how we can locate them and apply them. Once we have Photoshop open and we have a picture on screen, what we normally do to apply textures is something like this. I'm going to go to my filters menu, down to texture and texturizer, and in the options over on the right hand side, in the little drop down options we have here, we normally see brick, burlap, canvas and sandstone, and of course we can adjust the settings of these with the scaling and the relief, but generally speaking in the past we've made our selections and applied them to the image. Now there's a much better way to do this, so I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to undo that application of the texture. I'm going to suggest we go to the layers menu at the top left of the screen, and we're going to create a new layer. But from the mode here, I'm going to change it to overlay, and I'm going to tick this little box to fill this with a neutral 50% grey. If we created a new layer above the image we're viewing here and flooded it with 50% grey, we'd expect the image to disappear and we would see the grey. But because of the overlay, we don't. Now that means we can apply the texture to this layer. Let me quickly demonstrate that by going up to the filters menu, and I'll apply the texturizer we had a few seconds ago. There you see exactly the same thing, but the advantage we have now is the textures on a new layer. So I've got the opportunity here to add a mask, to mask some of that texture, to turn it off, but there's something that's probably even more flexible than this. So once again I'll hit Ctrl Z to undo that texture, and we'll look at adding a smart filter, because as well as adding that new layer and blending it with the overlay option, if I go back to my filters, I'm going to turn this into a smart filter. Now we can go back and apply the filter, and we've got instant access back and forth to make changes on the fly. And what I'll do this time, I'll search for that paper filter we viewed a few moments ago. So I'll go to my filter, texture and texturizer. So we've got the normal 4, but over here we get the opportunity to load a texture. Now we need to navigate to where we've put it. I'm working in my video recordings folder. I seem to be in the right place. That's the one, dirty paper. Now we can only see 2 versions of that texture, and remember the reason why is because Photoshop cannot see the PNGs. What I'm going to do is just to select this one, which is the seamless one, and we'll instantly see the texture, but of course the relief here needs to be a bit greater because the texture is different, and of course the scaling is quite large too. So we can make our choices here, and I'll make it a bit stronger than I normally would. We've got the light coming from the bottom right, but it doesn't really matter too much, I don't think. Whether we have it bottom left, top left, we're getting a nice texture there. Let's apply it. And now we can see something a little different. Plus we can see the texture on the image. Now of course we can sit here and we can evaluate the texture, but if I wanted to make a change, I can go to the option sitting at the bottom of this two-layer group. If I double click Texturizer, I'm straight back into the texture we just applied. So I could decide to drop the scaling down if that's what I was looking to do. I could decide to change the relief, and then I can reapply it. Working on a smart filter like this, we've got that opportunity to do that as many times as we wish. And of course the other thing we get with a smart filter is a layer mask. If I click the mask to select it, I could decide to reduce the impact of the texture just in strategic areas. So if I go over to the bottom of my toolbox and select black, for example, and I pick up a soft edge brush, you can see the flow is about 6% at the top of the screen. I could increase that a little bit. I want my opacity up to 100%. I'm going to click this little option here so I can adjust this using the keys. So I've just hit the number 1 key. So if I wanted to reduce the impact of my texture, maybe along the horizon there, you can see that's pretty easy to do. And as you know, with a layer mask, if we change our mind after a while, we can always repair the mask. So we've got infinite control here on how we apply our textures, and once again, if we save all of these as a Photoshop file, we can look at the image tomorrow and decide if we still think we've got the settings right. And of course this option is open to all of the filters, because if I change my mind completely and I click the texturizer and I went back to the option where we searched for that and I loaded another texture, well, if I go back to my textures, I did put a few in here. There you can see those that I referred to earlier on. I've got a few in each of these folders, so let's take leather as an example. Here we've got weathered 1 and weathered 2. Let me select weathered 1. Wow, that's a little bit high. Let's drop the relief down because this one looks much nicer with the relief quite low. The scaling's quite low, but you can see there we've got a nice cracked leather look that we can replace that previous texture with. Infinite control using that new layer blended with overlay, but then we've made it into a smart filter, the best of all worlds. As well as the textures that we find installed in Photoshop, we can also search the internet and find others that we can download. We can just drop them into a folder. As long as they're Photoshop files, we'll generally be able to locate them through Filters, Texture, Texturizer. But there are some other free Photoshop textures that we can locate via Find Extensions on Exchange. So let's open up Photoshop again and take a look. I'd like to take you up to the top of the screen here to the Window option, and that's what we're looking for, Find Extensions on Exchange, and we'll be taken to a web page. Now when this page appears on screen, you can see there seems to be a little problem with it. It appears to be jumping about a little bit erratically, and I want to get to an option that's just down the bottom center of the screen. Now I'm not entirely sure why what I'm about to suggest works, but it does. I'm going to take you back into Photoshop, back to the Windows menu, and I'm going to go and select the same option again. And for reasons I can't really explain, it seems to anchor the page still. I think it's a Chrome issue, because when I tried this in Windows Explorer, it didn't do any of that jumping around. Now the reason I wanted a stable page is because I want to take you down to the option we can see here, Adobe Paper Textures Pro, and it's free. I'm going to click to select that. you can see something happening, and it's taken us to this page, and what you need to look for is this option here, nice little tick in a green box that says acquired. That looks positive. Let's go back into Photoshop and take a look. Now it seems a good idea, once we've got that green tick we looked at on the website, that we close Photoshop down and relaunch it. That's what I've done, and I've brought up a picture, and I'm going to take you back to the Windows menu now, and we're going to go down to the extensions, and there we can see the Adobe Paper Texture Pro. When I click it, the little panel appears on the right hand side, and we appear to have quite a number of textures. If I just mouse over them and you look up at the top right, you can see each of them have got a name. So if we find some favorites here, at least we can have a reference of a name. But here is how they work. All I've got to do is just click the texture or the paper surface, and Photoshop applies it automatically. Not only does it apply it, it blends it with overlay, but we get the opportunity to choose any of the others, but for this demonstration I'll stay with the default, and of course that's reflected here. And this also gives us a layer mask for the same reasons we looked at a few moments ago. We can temper the texture in certain areas. If we want to remove this, we can drop it in the bin, but if we just click again, the paper texture is removed. Now one thing you'll also notice is if you were to come over here and just click the thumbnail for some reason, then the paper textures all rattle back into their holding area. But you can just click the icon and they'll open up. Now if you lose these at any time, then you can also locate them in the Windows menu, as I did a few moments ago. Another great thing about these filters is we can apply more than one. So I could apply this one and this one, and I'm getting one filter added to another, and I'm building them up, as you can see, one on top of the other. Now as always, we can save this as a Photoshop file. If and when we do and we come back in, all these will remain ticked, but I still have the opportunity to make adjustments wherever I feel it's necessary. Now with the spinning round of the screen, you can see I've applied two different paper textures. This one is called Necropolis, and this one I've applied over the top is Metallic Ice. But let's assume here that I want to reduce the impact of the texture on certain parts of the car. Well, I've got two layers to worry about. But in fact, if I turn one of those layers off and select the mask of the other one, go over to the bottom of the toolbox and select black and a soft edge brush. I can, if I keep my flow rate down to about 10%, I could just remove some of the impact of that texture in certain locations on this image, and it could be different with each image we create. You can see a little bit of texture right on the roof of the car. If I wanted to drop down the brush size and remove that, you can see I can do that pretty easily. But when I turn the other layer on, then of course the texture from that is now affecting the car. We can get around that by holding the Alt key, because I can drag this mask onto this one. The answer to this question is yes. And now we've got the identical mask on both layers. So I've got my car masked just where I want it. Now as you can see here by the spinning round of the screen, I've opened up a completely different subject, and I've added 3 of the paper filters there. You can see what they're called as I mouse over them. But one of the things we ought to do, I suppose, is not to stay constantly with the blend mode of overlay, because we can change it for one or all of these. So from time to time, particularly if you're working with Photoshop 2019, if I was to select the filter effect at the top, I can drop down the window here and we get an instant view as I mouse over all of the options. Some of them are not going to be very effective, but it's very quick these days to just mouse over them, and from time to time you will find something that works a little bit better, and you can either choose to stay with it or move on to something else. Now these paper textures I think are pretty good, and I'm certain I'm going to make more use of these. We've got some other options here, but one of them I'd like to look at is this one. I've not even used this at all. This will be the first time I've used it while recording here. I can say how many textures to use. I can randomize the blend modes. Let's tick that. Create a random combination. Well, let's have a look. That looks pretty good. Let's hit it again. Well, that would be an option, wouldn't it? Let's try 4 textures and click the random. Now we can see them all building up. Not quite so successful with 4. Maybe we'll drop back to 3. Well, I think you get the idea. And down here we can choose to remove all the textures, but I don't think I'll do that.